Hello, AP Psych students. Welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing Module 36. So we're going to be getting into the end of our cognition unit for this semester. So as semester one is kind of coming to a close, there is still the intelligence portion of this unit in the course exam description, and I'm going to be assigning that as homework over the break. You guys are going to be reading through that, and I'm going to give you some activities to go through, but it's pretty simple. So today, though, we're going to focus on the last learning target within the course exam description, and that is 5.11, the components of language and language acquisition. In your book, this is Module 36. So we're going to talk about the various different aspects of language acquisition and the major theories that apply to languages, to the development of language. Your homework is to just start reviewing for your final exam, as that is coming up here very shortly during finals week, okay, which is the week after this. So let's go ahead and get into our content. So when we look at language structure, first let's talk about what language is, right? Language is something that we use all the time. It's fairly complex, but extremely important in terms of our understanding, our ability to speak, our ability to communicate with others about the past, the present, the future. It involves our thinking, it involves our ability to solve problems, and so language is transmitted through various different systematic rules, and it's the communication of information through symbols arranged in three specific systematic rules. And the first one is phonemes, which is your most simplest unit. Then you have morphemes, units of meaning, and then you have syntax. So of all of these three systematic rules, the most complex is probably semantics. So when we look at language structure, as we talked about the three basic systematic rules, you have phonemes, which is your smallest unit of sound in human languages. And phonemes can be represented by a single letter, such as a consonant, like the letter T at the end of bat, or a vowel, like the letter A in the word bat. Okay? So all of these have their own individual distinct sounds, but you could also use a combination of letters to develop a sound as well, like ch in the word chat or sh in the word shoot. Okay, we can produce about 100 different recognizable sounds, but not all of our sounds are necessarily used in all languages. For instance, the English language uses about 43 sounds, while other languages can use maybe up to 85 sounds or even 15 sounds. So depending on the language, the phonemes that are used vary. And so our next systematic rule within language is morphemes. So morphemes are the smallest unit, not of sound, but the smallest unit of meaning. So that's where they differ from phonemes. Phonemes don't have meaning. Morphemes actually have meaning. And this is a word that is made up of maybe one or more phonemes. So morphemes can actually be a word by themselves. You can just have one morpheme. So, for instance, if you took the word I, like I am Ryan, okay, I in that sentence is a morpheme. It has meaning by itself. Okay, you could also take other words and add suffixes right to the end. And so if we look at this word here, fearlessness, okay, fear would be the root word. You also have less and ness as the suffix at the end. And so ness and less also have meanings by themselves. Or you could take the word unbreakable, right? What's the root word there? Break, okay? Un would be the prefix and able would be the suffix, unbreakable. So unbreakable would have three morphemes as well. So sometimes you can get these confused. An easy way to remember it is PM. Okay, a little mnemonic device for you there, right? P comes first, M comes second. right? P is the sound, morpheme is the actual meaning. Phoneme is the sound, morpheme is the meaning. Next, let's look at grammar, okay? Grammar regarding syntax. And so this is the other third component that we need to discuss here. And it refers to the rules for combining words into meaningful phrases, into meaningful sentences to actually be able to express what we're trying to say to other people. So for example, in English, you have to follow subject, verb, and then object. And within that, you need to put the adjectives in front of your nouns. And so if you saw a sentence that said, boy, small bike, large road, okay, that wouldn't make any sense, right? But if you were to say, the small boy rode a large bike, it completely changes the ability to understand what is trying to be expressed, okay? Just by following that SVO and that putting those adjectives in front of your nouns. It makes more sense. So every language has its own rules. As I talked about, English generally follows subject, verb, and then object. In Korean, they actually do it differently. It's subject, object, and then verb always goes at the end. The verb is always at the end, right? In English, the verb is not. It's never at the end. So you see various different types of syntax and grammar rules that help us understand what is trying to be said. Right, so within language development, you've got this table here, and it basically explains the whole process of how we learn language from ages 4 months to about 24 months and beyond. And you guys are going to do an activity on this, so I'm not going to go into much detail. So you start out with the babbling stage, right, where everything's pretty much meaningless. Infants who are unable to hear are actually exposed to sign language from birth. They'll babble with their hands, and so you do still see a bit of language developing at ages 4 months to 12 months. Next, you have the one-word stage, and this takes place at around their first birthday, and by this time they've already learned that sounds carry meanings, and if repeatedly trained to associate, say, fish with a picture of a fish, the children will eventually be able to say fish, 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 right? And what this means to them is actually look at the fish, right? Or in that one-word stage, when they say the word, oh, doggy, doggy, it may equal a sentence, look at the dog out there, okay? By the time they get to 18 months, children's word learning explodes from about 1 word per week to about a word per day. And by their second birthday, they've now entered that two-word stage where they can now utter 2-word sentences in telegraphic speech, so they can actually use syntax and say things like want juice, and arrange words in a sensible order that has meaning. Next, let's look at a confusing topic here regarding language, and that would be linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. So they're different, but they all fall under this hypothesis of linguistic relativity, or the Benjamin Lee Whorf and Sphere hypothesis. You might see that on an AP exam as well. I believe your book calls it linguistic influence instead of linguistic relativity. But this is basically just about how we shape our experiences, how we shape our perceptions, and how we interact and interpret the world around us. And so linguistic determinism, kind of the more intense version of the two, states that the language you're born into determines the thoughts that you will have. Your language completely dictates or directs your perceptions, behaviors, and attitudes. So if you don't have past tense verbs in your language, then you can't think at all in past tense. You can't think about the past, right? Okay, it's a bit of an extreme version, and this idea, again, states that language basically imprisons the way people think, the way people perceive and understand the world. Okay, your other version is a little less intense, and that is known as linguistic relativity. So linguistic relativity is going to focus more on the influences or the biases that occur from our cultures that impact our perceptions and our thinking. And so people who have the ability to speak various different languages, their thoughts can be recreated and reshaped in a sense, as they have different perceptions from two different sides of understanding. And so obviously the more languages you know, the more aware you will be of the world around you and your ability to perceive things and interpret things differently. But with linguistic relativity, language influences our thinking and our perception. So when you look at different languages, for instance, like the pronoun you, okay? In English, the pronoun you literally refers to everyone. But in French, it has an informal version and a formal version. And then in Japanese, it has 9 forms to be used in different varieties of formality or informality, but also in regards to tone in Japanese. You've got tones that suggest rudeness, tones that suggest consideration, that suggest joking, okay, that suggest seriousness. So various different tones that you can use for this one pronoun in English that just refers to one formality and one tone. Therefore, language shapes and influences people's thoughts to consider the status of maybe a relationship, okay, in terms of formality versus informality, or a tone regarding whether it's rude, considerate, joking, serious, etc., in a way that English doesn't necessarily require when just using this example of the pronoun you. So this is an example of linguistic relativity, as it explains that speaking different languages can change the influences and the perceptions of another person's interpretation of what you're saying. Okay? Now, which view is correct? Linguistic determinism or linguistic relativity? Most research actually refutes both. A lot of studies now suggest that instead of language being the influence of our thinking, it's actually the thinking that produces the language. And so therefore thinking comes first before language. So this is a big debate. It's a big question. But it is still in the introductory psychology textbooks, and so you still need to understand this, even though it's a controversial subject and it's becoming less and less, the validity of it's becoming less and less reliable. So in that last slide, we looked at the first debate regarding the chicken and the egg problem, right? What comes first, thought or language or thought? The other major debate is a debate we've seen kind of come up a variety of points throughout this course, and that is the nature versus nurture debate. And so there are two major theories or explanations for how we develop language. And the first one is the learning theory. The other is the innate theory, the nativist theory by Chomsky. And so the learning theory basically states that we learn language by social reinforcement, conditioning discovered by psychologists who study learning. So an example of this would be if a child says mama, that child receives a hug, right, or receives praise for speaking, and therefore that reinforcement of that behavior makes the child want to repeat it more and more likely. And so behaviorists like Skinner, right, he actually wrote a book on this, and he's the one who really developed this theory, and it was entitled Verbal Behavior, in which he argued that children learn to speak the way animals basically learn to run mazes. So they associate objects and words, and they imitate adults and repeat these phrases because they're met with social reinforcement. So the view suggests that children first learn to speak by being rewarded for making sounds that approximate speech. And through this process of shaping, eventually language becomes more and more like adult speech. So this theory is not very successful in explaining how children actually acquire language rules, but it does have some advantages in the sense that we see that within the learning theory approach to the development of language acquisition, the more parents actually speak to their children, the more proficient those children will become in language use. In addition to that, by the time children are 3 years old, if they hear their parents speak levels of more linguistic sophistication, then their speech rate, their vocabulary growth will also have a greater increase than those parents who do not speak to their children in that level of linguistic sophistication. So it does have some validity. So our next theory here is by our popular and well-known psychologist, Noam Chomsky. He believed in the nativist approach that language is an innate skill. So linguist Noam Chomsky believed that the learning theory really couldn't account for the explanation of the rapid speed in which humans acquire language. Right? So he provided an alternative way of looking at language acquisition. And Chomsky argued that humans are born essentially with this innate linguistic capability that emerges primarily as a function of what's known as maturation. Okay, we'll look at maturation even more when we get into the developmental psychology unit. And so according to his nativist approach to language, all world's languages share the same exact underlying structure called universal grammar. And Chomsky suggested that the human brain has this neural system, the language acquisition device, kind of is the metaphor that he uses, and it not only lets us understand the structure language provides, but it also gives us the strategies and the techniques for learning those unique characteristics of our native tongues. Okay, so this concept known as the language acquisition device, it was a metaphor. He did not necessarily identify a specific area in our brain in which it resides. However, more and more through neuroscience, we have understood the developments of our left hemisphere, right? When looking at areas like the angular gyrus, looking at the Wernicke's area, the Broca's area, and how all of these different association areas in our brain are associated with this language acquisition device. So our last theory I want to look at here is known as the critical period, and this is where theorists argue that there is a critical period that exists for language development early in our lives, in which a child is particularly sensitive to language cues and most easily acquires language acquisition. So in fact, if children are not exposed to language during this critical period, then later they will have a very difficult time overcoming this deficit. And so after about ages 5, it becomes increasingly difficult. The best peak in which to develop language acquisition is between 2 to 3 years old. This is when you really see language development taking off. After age 7, at about age 7, those who have not been exposed to either a spoken language or a signed language almost entirely lose their ability to ever master a language, no matter how much intensive instruction is given to them. And a great example of this is Jeannie. There's a case study, Jeannie. I've shown the documentary in class in previous years, but basically she was abused as a child and locked in her room for 13 years and had little to no interaction with any humans. And so she was not able to speak any words when they found her and rescued her at the age of 13. And despite the intensive instruction and therapy that she went through later on throughout her life, while she was able to develop some language, she could never master the complexities of true language acquisition. So this goes to show that there is a critical period in which we learn languages. And even in adults who are learning a second language, generally they'll still speak that second language with some form of accent from their native tongue, right? So they can never fully master the grammar and the ability to speak another language. They can be pretty good at it, but they can't fully master it. All right, so let's go ahead and review some of the concepts that we've discussed in class today. Go ahead and answer this question. And the answer is B. Influence language has on thinking. Okay, let's look at the second question here. Noam Chomsky believes that all we need to acquire language is A. Exposure to language in early childhood. Phonemes are units of sound in a language. Okay, and our last question for today. The answer is syntax. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you guys next time.